The army outside the walls had brought enough food to last for years. They had brought wheat to plant and harvest. They had brought seeds, farming implements, and thousands of animals loaded with provisions for every contingency anyone could imagine. By the second winter, according to the Byzantine chronicler Theophanes the Confessor, they were eating their dead. Contemporary records document what arrived at Constantinople in the summer of 717. Somewhere between 80,000 and 120,000 soldiers and 1,800 ships. The historian Warren Treadgold has calculated that the Arab force may have outnumbered the entire Byzantine army. Behind the walls, defending the city, perhaps 15,000 men, Treadgold's estimate, not a figure from any primary source, which tells you something about how completely the defenders were outmatched on paper. The Umayyad Caliphate had already conquered everything between Spain and India. Constantinople was the last thing standing between Islamic expansion and an undefended Europe. Not a border skirmish, not a territorial raid. An empire sending everything it had, across land and sea simultaneously, to end a civilization. They failed completely. And the man who stopped them had been emperor for less than 5 months when their ships appeared. But here is what the chronicles have never fully explained. Leo III spoke Arabic as his native language. He had spent his entire adult life on the Arab frontier. He had sat across from the Arab commander Maslama ibn Abd al-Malik, negotiated in Maslama's own tongue, made promises that sounded unambiguous in Arabic and Byzantine Greek alike, and then broke every single one the moment Constantinople's gates closed behind him. The question is not whether the deception worked. The chronicles make clear it did. The question historians circle without resolving is whether this was cold calculation from the very first conversation, or whether something shifted in Leo the moment the crown touched his head. The man who deceived Maslama at Amorium somehow became the man who spent the next 24 years defending those walls with an intensity that contemporaries struggled to name. Something crystallized at Constantinople. The sources record what Leo did. They never explain when he decided to. By the end of this video, you will understand 3 documented facts that most accounts of this siege overlook entirely. You will discover that the Arab naval blockade, the strategic centerpiece of a campaign planned for a decade, collapsed within 72 hours of the fleet's arrival, not from sustained battle, but because of a wind shift that drifted 20 ships into Byzantine range, and a chain Leo raised that same night. You will discover that the intelligence destroying the Arab reinforcement fleets in spring 718 came not from Byzantine spies, but from Coptic Christians, Egyptians conscripted onto Arab warships, who rode to the Byzantine walls in darkness and handed Leo exactly what he needed. And you will discover that the siege's failure directly triggered a century of internal war inside the Byzantine Empire itself, because Leo interpreted his impossible victory as proof that God favored those who banned religious images and launched the Iconoclast controversy that fractured the very church he had just saved. To understand how a city with 15,000 defenders broke the greatest military expedition the medieval world had assembled, we need to go back 22 years. And the moment the Byzantine Empire began destroying its own ability to survive, while the civilization preparing to destroy it was winning everything it touched. Between 695 and 717, the Byzantine throne changed hands 7 times through violent military coups. 7 emperors in 22 years, none dying peacefully in office, most blinded, mutilated, or exiled by the armies that had installed them in the first place. What historians call the 20 Years' Anarchy was not merely political instability or dynastic confusion. It was the systematic, cumulative destruction of the only institution that could have defended the empire against what was coming. And it was largely self-inflicted, powered by the very military apparatus that was supposed to protect it. The structural cause of this collapse was the thematic system, the division of Byzantine territory into military districts, each governed by a strategos whose combined civil and military authority gave him, in practice, everything needed to march on Constantinople. The armies of the great themes competed not for frontiers, but for the throne itself. The Opsikion themes soldiers installed and deposed emperors with a frequency that made governance impossible. The Anatolikon and Armeniac themes produced generals who believed the throne was simply the natural reward for military competence. The result was a generation of emperors defined not by policy or ability, but by how quickly they were overthrown. Philippikos Bardanes alienated the capital and the military simultaneously with his monothelite religious controversies, a theological position that managed to offend both the Western Church and large portions of the Eastern military aristocracy. Anastasius II, the emperor who actually began serious preparations for the Arab assault that Byzantine intelligence had detected, was deposed by his own troops in 715 and replaced by Theodosius III, a man whom contemporary sources describe, without mercy, as a former customs officer elevated to the purple by soldiers who wanted a compliant figurehead and received exactly that. These were not capable leaders navigating complicated circumstances. They were placeholders in a system that had turned its weapons inward, and the frontiers bled for it. The consequences for Byzantine territorial integrity were catastrophic and, in many cases, permanent. North Africa was lost during this period, not gradually weakened, but definitively severed from the empire. With Carthage fallen and Arab armies crossing the Strait of Gibraltar to begin the conquest of Iberia. Cilicia fell, bringing the Umayyad frontier to the edge of the Anatolian plateau. Year by year, Arab raids penetrated deeper into Asia Minor, reaching further into territories that Byzantine commanders were too busy fighting each other to defend. Border fortresses fell without relief. Local populations were raided and sometimes displaced. The military system designed to project defensive force outward had become entirely absorbed in projecting political force inward toward Constantinople. And the frontiers were paying the price in blood and territory. What made the situation particularly dangerous, and particularly ironic, was that Byzantine intelligence had not stopped functioning during the anarchy. Agents detected Umayyad preparations for a major assault beginning around 715. The empire knew, with years of warning, what was being assembled against it. Emperor Anastasius II actually responded to this intelligence seriously. He began stockpiling provisions, initiated fortification repairs, and attempted the kind of systematic defensive preparation that the situation demanded. Then he was deposed. His successor, Theodosius III, the customs officer, proved entirely incapable of continuing what Anastasius had started. The throne changed hands yet again in 717, when Leo III, the strategos of the Anatolic theme, marched on Constantinople, forced Theodosius's abdication, and seized the purple. The empire had changed emperors twice in the final 2 years before the most dangerous force it had ever faced arrived at the walls. The Umayyad Caliphate had been observing this collapse for 20 years. They had watched Byzantine armies march on Constantinople instead of defending Cilicia. They had watched competent emperors replaced by customs officers and compliant figureheads. They had watched the richest, most sophisticated Christian empire in the known world spend 2 decades systematically degrading its own defensive capacity. The decision to move against Constantinople in 717 was not impulsive, not opportunistic in a narrow sense. It was the rational conclusion drawn from 2 decades of patient, careful observation. The empire was destroying itself. The time had come to finish the destruction. But outside those walls, while Byzantium tore itself apart, something very different had been happening, and understanding it requires understanding what the Caliphate had become. By 717, the Umayyad Caliphate stretched from the Iberian Peninsula and the Maghreb in the west to the Indus Valley and Transoxiana in the east. In less than a century of expansion from the Arabian Peninsula, Arab armies had conquered territory that had taken Rome 500 years to accumulate at the height of its power. The speed of this expansion was not merely a military achievement in the eyes of those who had accomplished it. In the theology of the early caliphate, it was a continuous, visible, ongoing demonstration that divine favor was active in history, that God was directing the arc of civilization, and that the arc was bending unmistakably toward Islam. Constantinople sat at the center of this theological problem in ways that went beyond ordinary strategic competition. The Byzantine Empire was not simply an enemy to be defeated for territorial gain or strategic advantage. It was the self-proclaimed civilizational counterweight to Islam, the eastern remnant of Rome, still calling itself the Roman Empire after the western half had collapsed nearly 3 centuries earlier, still administering Roman law, still defending what it considered the legitimate inheritance of both Caesar and Christ. For the Umayyad caliphs, capturing Constantinople would simultaneously control the Bosphorus, the strategic crossing between Europe and Asia, command the most profitable trade routes connecting the Mediterranean world to the east, and deliver the ultimate theological argument, the visible, undeniable proof that the God of Islam had definitively superseded the God of Eastern Christendom. Arab sources record that Caliph Sulayman ibn Abd al-Malik pursued this campaign in part because of a prophecy embedded in Islamic tradition. A well-known hadith held that a caliph bearing the name of a prophet would capture Constantinople. Sulayman, Solomon, was the only Umayyad ruler to hold such a name. Whether this prophecy genuinely shaped his strategic calculations or became a post hoc theological justification for a campaign already planned on military and political grounds, Arab chronicles consistently record it as his explicit, stated motivation. He believed it was his destiny to take the city. He organized the full resources of the world's most powerful empire around that belief. And he did so with a thoroughness that made the resulting expedition the largest single military undertaking the medieval world had yet assembled. The scale of preparation is almost incomprehensible at 13 centuries distance. The force brought siege engines specifically designed for the reduction of fortified positions. It stockpiled naphtha and other incendiary materials for naval and land warfare. According to the 13th century historian Bar Hebraeus, a late source whose figures must be treated with appropriate caution, the troops included 30,000 volunteers for the Holy War, men whose presence transformed the military expedition into something explicitly framed as a religious duty. Most remarkably, and most revealing about the strategic confidence of those who planned it, the expedition carried wheat seeds and farming implements, not because the planners expected a quick campaign, because they planned to plant and harvest their own food in the fields outside Constantinople's walls during what they expected to be a long but ultimately successful siege. This was the supreme expression of strategic confidence. An army prepared not just to fight, but to inhabit the territory it was attacking. The drive for Constantinople had deep institutional roots that predated Sulayman's reign entirely. The Caliphate had attempted the city before, during the reign of Muawiyah I. when Arab fleets had operated against Constantinople intermittently between 674 and 678. That effort had failed, largely due to a Byzantine weapon called Greek fire, whose exact formula has never been recovered and which we will examine in detail shortly. But the failure had not extinguished the ambition. It had redirected it into preparation. Following that defeat, successive caliphs spent nearly 4 decades rebuilding the naval infrastructure, refining the logistics, and developing the military capacity needed for a second, definitively resourced attempt. Caliph al-Walid I began planning the new expedition and died before it launched. His brother Suleiman inherited the plan, escalated it to a scale that exceeded anything previously attempted, and sent his most experienced and battle-tested frontier general to execute it. Standing against this civilization at the absolute peak of its power, against its prophetic mandate, its decade of preparation, its 1,800 ships, was a man who had spent his entire life learning exactly how Arabs thought, fought, and trusted. A man who had recently given them every reason to believe he was their ally. The chronicles cannot agree on Leo III's exact birth year. They disagree on some details of his early career. What they record with a specificity that suggests genuine historical memory rather than later invention is the single fact that shaped everything else about him, his origin. Leo was born Conon, somewhere between 675 and 685, in Germanicaea, in the region of Umayyad. In what is now southeastern Turkey, on the Syrian borderlands where the Byzantine and Arab worlds overlapped daily, where Greek and Arabic were both languages of commerce and negotiation, where a person who paid attention could learn both cultures from the inside. He grew up speaking Arabic as his native language. Theophanes the Confessor, the primary Byzantine chronicler, described him as the Saracen-minded, an epithet that was not intended as a compliment. And that reflects the discomfort of a Byzantine ecclesiastical writer confronting an emperor whose mental architecture was partly Arab. In Theophanes' vocabulary, it meant Leo thought in ways that were uncomfortably comprehensible to the enemy. What Theophanes did not fully reckon with was that this was precisely why Leo survived everything that came at him, and precisely why he was able to do what no other Byzantine commander had managed against the Caliphate. His family was resettled to Mesembria on the Black Sea coast by Justinian II, as part of one of that emperor's population movements along the imperial frontiers. Leo entered imperial service under Justinian, earned the prestigious rank of Spatharios, imperial attendant, a position in the emperor's personal household. As reward for helping Justinian recover his throne in 705 during one of the earlier coups that defined the anarchy. Justinian, apparently developing suspicions about this capable young Syrian whose abilities were becoming impossible to overlook, subsequently dispatched Leo on a diplomatic mission among the Alani people on the remote eastern frontier. An assignment that Britannica notes the emperor appears to have expected would prove fatal. Leo survived. He completed the mission through a combination of diplomatic skill and personal stubbornness that the sources acknowledge without fully explaining, returned to Constantinople, and continued a career that Justinian had apparently hoped to end permanently. The assignment that would make Leo emperor came under Emperor Anastasius II, who appointed Leo strategos of the Anatolic theme, the empire's largest and most strategically critical military district, the one directly facing the Arab world across the frontier that Leo had spent his entire life learning to read from multiple directions at once. When Anastasius was deposed by Theodosius III in 715, Leo refused to recognize the new emperor's authority. He allied with Artabasdos, the strategos of the Armeniac theme, who happened to be betrothed to Leo's daughter Anna, providing both personal motivation and organizational structure for the alliance. And the two commanders began their coordinated march on Constantinople. Multiple source traditions, Byzantine, Syriac, and Arab chronicles, which rarely agree on anything, all record the essential core of what Leo did next. When Maslama's forces besieged the strategic Anatolian city of Amorium in 716, Leo entered direct negotiations with the Arab commander. He spoke to Maslama in Arabic, not translated Arabic, not the careful formal Arabic of a diplomat relying on intermediaries, but the Arabic of a man who had grown up speaking it and who understood its cultural registers and its rhetorical conventions from childhood. He presented himself as a potential ally, a general willing to reach the Byzantine throne with Arab support, who would then govern as, in effect, a friendly client of the Caliphate, delivering the empire from within rather than requiring a costly siege from without. Maslama believed him. The Arab commander called off his devastation of Anatolian territory, effectively halting the raid that was stripping the region bare, and gave Leo the operational freedom to march on Constantinople without pressure from the rear. Leo captured Theodosius III's son at Nicomedia, using the captive as the leverage that persuaded the feeble emperor that resistance was pointless. Theodosius abdicated. On the 25th of March, 717, Leo was crowned Emperor Leo III by Patriarch Germanus I in the Hagia Sophia, the great church that symbolized Byzantine civilization's confidence in God's protection. The moment that crown touched his head, every promise he had made to Maslama was void. He immediately repudiated every agreement with the Arabs and began preparing the city for the siege he knew was coming, because he had spent months negotiating with the man who would lead it and had listened to every detail of Umayyad's strategy with a strategist's unflinching attention. Maslama, in Britannica's direct assessment, __quote_0__. He had been outmaneuvered by a man who understood Arabic diplomatic protocol from the inside, who had used that understanding to neutralize the Arab threat long enough to secure the throne, and who had then transformed that narrow window of safety into 4.5 months of meticulous preparation for what was coming. Maslama ibn Abd al-Malik was the son of a caliph and the half-brother of 4 more. He was also excluded from the line of succession entirely because his mother was a slave concubine rather than a free woman of appropriate status. In the Umayyad dynastic system, birth determined access to power, and Maslama's birth had given him proximity to power without the formal claim to it. The caliphate would be held by his brothers. The armies would be commanded by him. Because everything he had accumulated, every governorship, every military commission, every piece of institutional authority he exercised, he had earned through performance rather than inheritance. When the men whose bloodlines guaranteed the throne needed someone to actually fight their wars, they sent Maslama. His military career began around 705, with the annual summer raids against Byzantine Anatolia, the Sawaif, the systematic, institutionalized program of frontier raiding that the Caliphate maintained year after year as a combination of economic extraction, intelligence gathering, and continuous pressure on Byzantine defensive capacity. By 709, his military record had accumulated enough distinction that he was appointed governor simultaneously of Shinasrin in northern Syria, the Jazira in Upper Mesopotamia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, a remarkable combination of commands that gave him effective control of the Caliphate's entire northwestern frontier. He captured the Byzantine city of Tiana in 708, after defeating a Byzantine relief force in the spring of that year. He raided deep into Amorium territory and Isauria 708 and 9. He took Melitene in 714. He launched the first Arab expeditions across the Caucasus against the Khazar Khaganate, opening a new front in the north while maintaining pressure in the west. This was not a general who had read about Byzantine tactics in dispatches sent from distant headquarters. He had spent 2 decades walking the same ground his enemy defended, learning its geography, testing its responses, cataloging its weaknesses. When Caliph Suleiman, too ill to lead the expedition himself, appointed Maslama to command the Constantinople campaign in 715, it was as much a meritocratic as a dynastic decision. Among all the commanders available to the caliphate, Maslama was the one who knew Byzantine military psychology, Anatolian geography, and the specific vulnerabilities of the empire's defensive architecture better than anyone alive. His lieutenants at the siege were named in the chronicles. Theophanes and Agapaius of Hierapolis both record Umar ibn Hubayra, Sulayman ibn Mu'ad, and Bakhtari ibn al-Hassan as Maslama's most prominent subordinates. Later Arab sources replaced Bakhtari with Abdallah al-Batal, who became celebrated in Arab and Turkish epic poetry as Batal Ghazi for his exploits in the Byzantine frontier raids of the following decades, a telling indication of how the Arab literary tradition chose to remember this campaign, which is to say, not primarily as the catastrophe it was, but as the launching point for subsequent individual heroics. The Amorium deception was, from Maslama's perspective, not naivety, but reasonable operational reasoning applied to available evidence. Leo genuinely was in revolt against Theodosius III. The Byzantine Empire genuinely was consumed by internal civil conflict. A frontier general who reached the Byzantine throne with Arab support, and who consequently owed his position to caliphate forbearance, was not an implausible outcome. Variations of this arrangement had functioned before in the fluid politics of the Byzantine succession crisis. What Maslama could not account for was a man who could negotiate in perfect Arabic while thinking in Byzantine strategic terms, who could project every outward marker of trustworthiness while planning his betrayal with the same systematic patience he would later apply to defending walls that Maslama's army would never breach. After the siege, Maslama was not disgraced in the terminal sense. He was redirected, sent to Iraq to suppress the Kharijite religious faction, then later appointed governor of Iraq, then dispatched to the Caucasus for campaigns against the Khazars that proved difficult and largely inconclusive. He retired eventually to his extensive estates in northern Syria. He died on the 24th of December, 738, exactly 20 years after the siege ended. When the Abbasid dynasty overthrew the Umayyads in 750 and conducted the systematic persecution of the Umayyad family that typically accompanied such revolutions. Maslama's descendants were, as Wikipedia records drawing on Arab sources, largely spared out of respect for his battlefield reputation. He had lost the most famous campaign of his career. His enemy's successors protected his family in professional acknowledgement of the kind of soldier he had been. History remembered him as a general. What that generosity says about the man who outmaneuvered him says at least as much about Leo. The Theodosian walls were completed in 413, more than 300 years before Maslama's army arrived to test them. Built under Emperor Theodosius II at a moment when the Western Roman Empire was beginning its terminal decline, and the Eastern Empire needed permanent defensive architecture capable of sustaining the empire indefinitely. Without the legions that would no longer be available, they were not a wall in any simple sense. They were a system, a sequence of overlapping, mutually supporting defensive zones designed by people who had studied every way fortifications could fail and built solutions for each failure mode into the stone itself. The outermost obstacle was a brick-lined moat 15 to 20 meters wide and up to 7 meters deep, divided by structural bulkheads at regular intervals and designed to be flooded on command. The flooding capability neutralized the most dangerous ancient siege technique, mining beneath foundations. Because wet, unstable ground does not allow the kind of controlled excavation that undermines masonry. Beyond the moat stood a low outer breastwork approximately 2 meters high, providing defenders with a forward firing platform protected from direct assault from which they could engage enemies attempting to cross or drain the moat. Past the breastwork rose the outer wall itself. 8 meters tall, 2.8 meters thick, interspersed with 92 projecting towers that created overlapping fields of fire against anything approaching the base of the wall from any angle. But an army that somehow fought through the outer wall did not find itself victorious. It found itself in the inner terrace, a killing ground 16 to 21 meters wide, with no cover, overlooked from 3 directions by the towers it had just fought through and from the front by what waited ahead. The main inner wall, the final and principal defensive barrier, stood 12 to 13 meters high, up to 5 meters thick, with 96 massive towers of square, hexagonal, and octagonal designs reaching 19 to 24 meters in height, spaced every 55 to 75 meters along its entire length. Archaeological studies of the walls confirm an engineering detail that reveals the sophistication of the people who built them and the depth of thought that went into their construction. The towers were not structurally bonded to the adjacent wall sections. Each tower was built independently of the walls on either side, so that it could settle into the Thracian soil at its own rate, without transmitting structural stress or differential movement to the adjacent wall. This meant that if one tower developed foundation problems over the centuries, it would not drag the walls flanking it into failure. 3 centuries of accumulated Roman engineering wisdom about long-term structural performance, embedded in stone and brick, building a system designed to outlast not just any individual siege, but the civilization that built it. Which, as it happened, is exactly what occurred. The city's triangular peninsula geography multiplied these walls' effectiveness in ways that transformed Maslama's numerical advantage from decisive to largely irrelevant in the context of direct assault. Water protected Constantinople on 2 sides. The Sea of Marmara to the south, the Golden Horn to the north. An attacking army could only approach the city across the narrow western land front where the Theodosian walls stood, which meant that 100,000 men could not be massed against those walls simultaneously because the geography simply did not accommodate that concentration. The width of the front, the narrowness of the approach, and the channeling effect of the terrain meant that numerical superiority beyond a certain threshold produced no additional tactical benefit against those particular defenses. Sealing the city's northern harbor was the great chain of the Golden Horn. Hand-forged iron links spanning the waterway from the Tower of Eugenius on the Constantinople shore to the fort of Galata on the northern bank, suspended by 8 massive pyramidal wooden pontoons, each roughly 20 by 15 meters at the base. Operated by a sophisticated system of wheels, pulleys, and water tower counterweights that allowed the entire barrier to be raised or lowered with sufficient speed to respond to naval threats. A fleet that could not penetrate the Golden Horn, could not threaten the city from the north, could not use the harbor as a staging area for seawall assault, and could not cut the city off from its northern supply routes without complete control of both the Golden Horn and the Black Sea approaches simultaneously. Hidden behind that chain, as Maslama's fleet approached in the summer of 717, was the Byzantine Navy's most closely guarded state secret: Greek fire, credited in the primary sources to Callinicos of Heliopolis, a Christian engineer and refugee from Syria who arrived in Constantinople around 673. though some modern historians suggest he may have refined an existing weapon rather than invented it entirely from nothing, was a petroleum-based incendiary compound delivered through bronze siphon tubes mounted on the prows of specialized warships called dromons. It burned on water, which no conventional extinguishing method could address. Its formula was classified as a state secret for 4 centuries and died with the last people who held it. It has never been recovered, and the best modern analysis can offer is that it was petroleum or naphtha-based, likely combined with quicklime and other combustibles. A 12th century Norse saga preserving what appears to be a genuine eyewitness or near contemporary description records a great din and fire so intense that a wooden ship became white ashes in moments. Maslama knew this weapon existed. He had been fighting Byzantines for 20 years. What he could not fully account for was how completely the man who had just become emperor had prepared to use it. 4.5 months. That was the entire interval between Leo's coronation on the 25th of March, 717, and the arrival of Maslama's army at the Theodosian walls on the 15th of August. For a man who had just seized the throne of a fractured empire through political deception, who had internal enemies watching him from within the palace bureaucracy and external ones who had every reason to consider him a traitor to agreements he had personally made, 4.5 months was both an almost impossibly compressed timeline and, as every subsequent event would demonstrate, precisely sufficient for what he intended to accomplish. Leo's first act as emperor was not a military deployment, not a diplomatic mission to seek allies, not a proclamation establishing his legitimacy. It was a mandate directed at every citizen in Constantinople. Stockpile 3 years of provisions within the city walls, not a prudent 1-year reserve for unexpected disruptions, not a cautionary 2-year surplus as insurance against a prolonged siege. 3 full years of food for a city whose population historians estimate at perhaps 500,000 people. An enormous, almost audacious commitment of resources and urban storage capacity. This single decision would prove more strategically decisive than any tactical maneuver in the siege that followed, because it addressed the fundamental premise of Maslama's entire strategic plan, before that plan had even been executed. The Arab strategy was starvation. Leo's provision stockpile made starvation impossible. While the Arab army outside the walls exhausted its provisions within months and was reduced to eating its horses, then its camels, then its dead, Constantinople fed itself from the Black Sea throughout every month of the siege. The 3-year stockpile was never even depleted. The Greek fire-equipped dromons were positioned within the Golden Horn during these 4.5 months, and critically, concealed there. Arab scouts approaching the city could observe the Great Chain, the sea walls, and the fortifications along the waterfront. They could not easily observe what was sheltered behind the chain in the protected harbor. Leo's fleet was not a visible deterrent that might inform Maslama's planning. It was a hidden instrument, a weapon that existed in Arab strategic calculations only as a general awareness of Byzantine naval capability, without specific knowledge of where it was positioned or what the chains raising would release. The Bulgarian alliance required the kind of diplomatic patience that Leo had demonstrated in such abundance at Amorium. The ability to project trustworthiness to someone whose interests were not identical to his own. Khan Tervel of Bulgaria had concluded a treaty with Byzantine authority around 716, possibly before Leo's coronation and likely renewed or confirmed afterward. The exact terms of this agreement have not survived in any of our sources. But Theophanes the Confessor records that Tervel committed to providing military support against the Arab invasion. Tervel held the Byzantine title of Caesar, the empire's second highest formal honor. which Justinian II had awarded him in 705 as payment for 15,000 Bulgarian cavalry that had helped Justinian recover his throne. Whether the alliance represented genuine loyalty to Byzantine interests, strategic Bulgarian self-defense against a caliphate that would inevitably threaten Bulgaria if it destroyed Constantinople, or some calculated combination of the two. Scholarly opinion inclines toward the self-interested reading, and the subsequent military relationship between Byzantium and Bulgaria in the decades after the siege suggests that self-interest was the dominant motive on both sides. Its military consequence was identical regardless of motivation. When the Arab army was most vulnerable, Bulgarian cavalry would strike from a direction Maslama could not fortify against and had perhaps not fully accounted for. The chronicles cannot tell us what Leo said to his generals, his advisors, or his city during those 4.5 months. The sources record his decisions and their consequences with reasonable precision. They are almost entirely silent on his private calculations, his doubts if he had any, his confidence if it ever faltered. What can be reconstructed from the decisions he made, the provisions, the fleet, the alliance, the fortification repairs, is the portrait of a man who had spent months negotiating with the enemy commander in Arabic, and had used every moment of those negotiations to map every vulnerability in the Arab strategic design. Each of his preparatory decisions addresses a specific failure point in Maslama's plan. The 3-year food supply addresses the starvation strategy. The hidden fleet addresses the naval blockade. The Bulgarian alliance addresses the land siege's exposure to pressure from the north. These were not reactions to unforeseen developments. They were anticipations made by someone who had heard Maslama's thinking from close range and prepared for what was coming at every point where preparation was possible. On the 1st of September, 717, the Arab fleet appeared in the Bosphorus. 2 days later, everything Maslama had planned began unraveling. On the 3rd of September, 717, Admiral Suleiman ordered his fleet to complete the naval blockade. The operational design was professionally sound and had been planned with the knowledge of Byzantine naval capabilities that came from 2 decades of Maslama's frontier experience. One contingent of ships would sail south of Chalcedon to seal the southern entrance of the Bosphorus Strait, preventing any naval relief from approaching Constantinople from the direction of the Aegean and the wider Mediterranean. The main body of the fleet would sail north past Constantinople and establish positions between Galata and Clydion on the northern shore, severing the city's communication and supply lines with the Black Sea and the breadbasket territories beyond it. Combined with the land circumvallation lines already being constructed along the western approach to the Theodosian walls, deep trenches and stone barricades running from the Sea of Marmara to the Golden Horn that would seal the city on its landward side. The completed blockade would encircle Constantinople completely on every approach. The campaign that had been planned and resourced for a decade was, on September the 3rd, 2 operational steps from completion. Theophanes the Confessor records what happened next with the precision of a man who understood he was documenting something that would be studied and discussed for as long as the Byzantine world endured. As the Arab fleet's rearguard, 20 heavy ships carrying 2,000 Marines, the units intended to garrison the positions that would seal the northern approaches, was navigating past the city toward the Golden Horn to take up their blocking positions. The prevailing southerly wind stopped, then reversed. This was not a gradual shift or an ambiguous change in conditions. The wind stopped and then blew from the opposite direction. The heavy transport vessels, which depended on that southerly wind for their forward headway, lost their momentum immediately. The powerful, unpredictable current of the Bosphorus Strait, a current that anyone who had spent time in those waters knew was treacherous and unforgiving for ships that lost their ability to maneuver, took the vessels and began driving them sideways and backward toward the Byzantine sea walls. 2,000 Marines on 20 heavy ships, helpless, drifting toward the walls of the city they had come to destroy. Leo was watching from the walls. The chronicles do not preserve the exact interval between the moment the wind reversed and the moment Leo gave his order. Theophanes describes the sequence of events rather than the seconds between them. What the sources make entirely clear is that the response was immediate and decisive. The Greek fire-equipped dromons, which had been concealed in the Golden Horn throughout the opening weeks of the siege, sortied through the chain entrance and struck the drifting Arab ships on the flank. Taken broadside at close range, before they could maneuver, before they could form any defensive line, before their oarsmen could generate the speed needed to escape the engagement, the heavy Arab vessels had no answer for what hit them. Greek fire from bronze siphon tubes at close range. Theophanes records that some ships went down with all hands while the fire was still burning on the water around them. Others, burning from stem to stern, drifted helplessly down the Bosphorus current to the Prince's Islands of Oxaia and Plataea in the Sea of Marmara, where Byzantine sources record they burned until nothing remained but ash on the water. That same night, the same night the 20 ships burned, the same night 2,000 Arab Marines went to the bottom of the Bosphorus or the Sea of Marmara, Leo raised the great chain across the Golden Horn. The Arab fleet, which had watched 20 of their ships destroyed in minutes by a weapon they could not approach or extinguish, made the rational decision and withdrew to the safe harbor of Sosthenion, further north on the European shore of the Bosphorus, well beyond the range at which Byzantine dromons would sortie against them. Theophanes provides a detail that makes the chain's raising even more significant. The Arabs had originally intended to use the cover of that same night for a direct assault on the Byzantine sea walls, planning to use the ship's own equipment to scale the walls from the sea. The chain raised in the dark made that impossible permanently. The strategic implications of what had just happened deserve to be stated with complete clarity. The Arab fleet had been in the Bosphorus for 48 hours. In those 48 hours, it had lost 20 ships with 2,000 men aboard before a single assault on the Theodosian walls had been attempted. It had surrendered control of the Golden Horn and access to the city's northern waterfront permanently. And it had failed to sever Constantinople's Black Sea supply route. The route that, thanks to Leo's 3-year provisions mandate, was already less critical than it would otherwise have been, but which remained open throughout the siege and continued to supply the city. The naval blockade, the strategic centerpiece of a campaign planned for a decade, the component without which the starvation strategy was simply impossible, had failed on its 3rd day of operation. Constantinople's fishermen returned to their boats and went back to work the next morning. Standard doctrine said an army of 100,000 with 1,800 ships could seal a single city. Standard doctrine had not accounted for a wind shift in the Bosphorus and a man who had spent 4.5 months waiting for exactly this moment. The winter of 717 to 718 was, in the historian John Norwich's careful description, the cruelest winter that anyone could remember. Snow fell on the Thracian plains in the autumn of 717 and remained. Not for days, not for weeks, but for 100 consecutive days. 100 days of continuous snow cover on ground that Maslama's army had already stripped bare of every edible resource during their march from the Hellespont to Constantinople. The fields they had devastated on the advance were frozen solid and could not be foraged. The territory beyond their circumvallation lines, where Bulgarian proximity and Byzantine cavalry patrols made deep foraging expeditions suicidal, was similarly unavailable. The supply routes across the Sea of Marmara that should have maintained the provisions of 80,000 to 120,000 men throughout the siege were continuously harassed by the Byzantine dromons that now operated without meaningful challenge in those waters. Having established naval supremacy in the immediate vicinity of the city on September the 3rd, the sequence of logistical collapse that Theophanes the Confessor documents in his chronicle is detailed enough to suggest either eyewitness accounts or access to documentary records from participants. The cavalry mounts were the first to die, slaughtered not in battle but for food, which produced an immediate secondary military consequence beyond the immediate caloric gain. Arab cavalry without horses could not conduct the mobile operations, the foraging expeditions, the long-range reconnaissance, or the rapid response to Byzantine sorties that were the army's primary operational tools. Destroying the cavalry mounts to feed the infantry was the kind of irreversible decision that marks the transition from a besieging army to a trapped one. After the horses came the camels, thousands of them, the specialized transport animals that had carried supplies across the Taurus Mountains and through Anatolia, now providing meat rather than logistics. Then the donkeys, the pack animals at the bottom of the transport hierarchy, whose loss completed the destruction of the army's ability to move or supply itself by land. The army then stripped bark and roots from whatever trees the frozen Thracian landscape offered, a desperation measure that produced minimal calories at significant effort. As the snows finally began to yield in early spring, and the ground allowed planting, soldiers swept the fields they had sown to eat the raw green shoots before they had grown to any useful height, the same wheat they had carried across the Aegean, specifically to grow their own food during what they had expected to be a long but ultimately successful siege, now being scraped from the frozen earth, half germinated, by men dying of starvation. Theophanes records, and his account is corroborated independently by two separate source traditions, the Byzantine liturgical Synaxaria and Paul the Deacon, the Lombard historian writing in Western Europe, that the famine eventually reached a point where the Arab forces consumed their dead. The fact that three independent source traditions, none of which had any reason to coordinate their accounts, and all of which were writing for different audiences in different languages, agree on this specific horror carries historical weight, even accounting for their shared tendency to present the Arab siege as catastrophically and divinely punished as possible. Paul the Deacon's specific claim of 300,000 dead from disease and starvation is rejected by every modern historian as rhetorical inflation, far exceeding any plausible estimate of the original force's size. The figure tells us about Paul's rhetorical conventions, not about Byzantine mortality statistics. But the agreement between Byzantine, Western, and liturgical sources on the core fact of what desperation drove the Arab soldiers to is harder to dismiss. Inside the walls, Constantinople was a different world. The city fed itself from the Black Sea throughout every month of the siege. The 3-year food stockpile that Leo had mandated in the 4.5 months before the siege began was demonstrating precisely why it had been the right decision. Not because it was needed as a primary food source, but because it meant that even if the Black Sea supply route had been interrupted, the city could survive indefinitely on what it had already stored. The contrast between the two sides of those walls was stark enough that Byzantine chroniclers recorded it with undisguised satisfaction. Inside, citizens going about their daily lives, fishermen on the water, markets functioning. Outside, the finest cavalry force the medieval world had assembled, eating horses, camels, roots, and eventually the bodies of its own dead in a frozen field, outside walls it could see but not touch. The Synaxaria preserve one additional detail from this winter that appears in no other source tradition. Arab soldiers reportedly found a condemned criminal in the suburbs of Constantinople, dressed him in mock imperial regalia, and paraded him around the walls while hailing him as Emperor of the Romans. Desperate psychological theater to sustain a morale that was visibly, irreversibly collapsing. By spring, Caliph Umar II had recognized that the siege required emergency intervention and sent everything he had left. One final attempt to salvage a campaign that was already past saving. They came in the dark. No chronicle records their names. No source records exactly how many boats they lowered. What hour they pushed off from the Arab ships. What they said to each other as they rowed away from the vessels they had been conscripted onto and toward the walls of a city they had been sent to help destroy. What the primary Byzantine sources document, and document clearly enough that the essential fact is not in serious scholarly dispute, is what they did and what it cost the Arab campaign at the precise moment when the campaign might otherwise have been partially salvaged. The Coptic Christian sailors crewing the Arab reinforcement fleets defected en masse to Constantinople in the spring of 718, and they carried with them exact, operational knowledge of where every Arab ship was anchored, what force each fleet contained, and what condition they were in. The reinforcement fleets had been dispatched by Caliph Umar II as the last serious attempt to rescue a siege that had already lost its naval component, endured a winter that had destroyed a significant portion of its army's fighting capacity, and consumed years of accumulated caliphate resources with nothing to show for the expenditure. The Egyptian fleet anchored in the Gulf of Nicomedia, to the southeast of Constantinople, a position carefully chosen to be well away from the Greek fire-equipped dromons that had demonstrated so conclusively in September what happened to Arab ships that came within range. The North African fleet held position south of Chalcedon on the Asian shore, similarly placed at what their commanders judged a safe distance from Byzantine naval reach. Their commanders knew about Greek fire. The Arab naval establishment had known about Greek fire since 678. The fleets had been positioned with that knowledge in mind, and the positioning was professionally sound. What the commanders could not account for was the religious composition of their own crews. The overwhelming majority of the sailors manning both reinforcement fleets were Coptic Christians from Egypt and North Africa, subjects of the conquered provinces, men pressed into naval service for an Islamic military expedition against the world's largest Christian city. They had no theological stake in the jihad they had been conscripted to support. They had no institutional loyalty to the Umayyad Caliphate that had conquered their homeland. They had every reason, once a viable alternative presented itself, to choose differently. Under cover of darkness, thousands of these men abandoned their posts, lowered the small boats that warships carried for various purposes, and rowed toward the Byzantine lines. Wikipedia's account, drawing directly on the primary Byzantine sources, records that the defectors provided Leo with exact intelligence regarding the disposition, precise anchoring positions, strength, and condition of both reinforcement fleets. Leo acted without hesitation. Byzantine dromons swept down on the Egyptian fleet in the Gulf of Nicomedia and the North African fleet south of Chalcedon before either force could form a coherent battle line, before their substantially depleted remaining crews could mount an effective defense, before their commanders had fully grasped what was happening. Crippled by mass desertions that had taken most of their experienced sailors, caught at anchor in positions whose coordinates Leo now knew exactly. The Arab vessels had no effective response to Greek fire delivered at close range by dromons, whose crews knew exactly where to go. Both reinforcement fleets were destroyed or captured, along with the fresh weapons, replacement troops, and desperately needed provisions they had carried to sustain a siege that had been failing for months. Simultaneously, a Byzantine land force intercepted the Arab Overland Relief Army, marching through Asia Minor under a commander the sources identify as Mardasan. The Byzantine force ambushed this relief column in the hills south of Nicomedia, the area the sources identify as Sophon, and destroyed it before it could reach Maslama's siege lines. The two-pronged relief operation that represented the Caliphate's final serious attempt to rescue the campaign had been eliminated in its entirety within a brief operational window. Constantinople could now be resupplied by sea without any Arab interference whatsoever. The Arab fleet that remained did not attempt further engagement with the Byzantine navy. The city's fishermen had been working for months. The greatest military expedition the medieval world had assembled had now lost its naval arm, its winter endurance, its reinforcement fleets, and its overland relief force. What it had left was a starving, diseased land army, sitting in trenches between the Theodosian walls and the approaching Bulgarian cavalry of Khan Tervel, who had been watching the Arab position deteriorate all winter. 9 years before he helped save the Byzantine Empire. Khan Tervel of Bulgaria had defeated Byzantine armies in the field. At the Battle of Anchialis in 708, his forces routed an imperial army that Emperor Justinian II had sent to recover territorial concessions he had made to Bulgaria just 3 years earlier. Concessions made as payment for the 15,000 Bulgarian cavalry that had helped Justinian recover his throne from its previous usurper in 705. The Bulgarians had made Justinian emperor. 3 years later, Justinian tried to take back what he had promised them for doing so. Tervel destroyed the Byzantine force sent to enforce the reversal. History offers few ironies as precisely documented as the fact that the man who delivered the decisive land blow against the greatest Arab assault in Byzantine history was the same man whose forces had humiliated Byzantine armies at Anchialis less than a decade before this siege began. An enemy who became an ally through the pressure of a greater threat, and who understood exactly what that greater threat was. Tervel was the son of Khan Asparuk, the founder of the First Bulgarian Empire and a member of the Dulo clan, the ruling house of the earliest Bulgarian state. He had held the Byzantine title of Caesar since 705, the empire's second highest formal honor, conferring a specific position in the Roman ceremonial hierarchy on the ruler of a state that Byzantine official ideology classified as barbarian. Justinian II had awarded it as part of the payment for that 15,000-man cavalry deployment, making Tervel the first foreign ruler in Byzantine history to receive this particular distinction. Whether Tervel was later baptized as a Christian, a claim made by later Bulgarian Orthodox hagiographic tradition in support of his eventual canonization, is a question the primary sources decline to answer. Theophanes the Confessor, who provides the most detailed Byzantine account of the siege and its participants, describes Tervel purely and consistently as a political and military ally, without any reference to baptism or religious conversion. Contemporary Byzantine sources do not support the later sainthood claim, and scholars note the distinction between what the primary record documents and what subsequent tradition added for its own purposes. His motivation for honoring the alliance with Leo was, as historian John Norwich observed in his assessment of this period, not primarily sentimental and not primarily religious. The Bulgars had no particular affection for Constantinople. They had been raiding Byzantine territory as recently as 712 and fighting Byzantine armies as recently as 708. What Tervel understood with the clarity of a ruler whose state sat directly north of Constantinople was the geography of his own position. If the Umayyad Caliphate captured Constantinople and extended its power across the Bosphorus into the Balkans, the First Bulgarian Empire would be the next target of Islamic expansion. There would be no Christian power behind Bulgaria to provide strategic depth or military support. The Bulgarian Empire was fighting for its own survival when it fought for Constantinople, and the sharp-edged pragmatism of that calculation is part of why Tervel's forces performed so decisively when they finally struck. In the summer of 718, with Maslama's army starving behind its circumvallation lines, its relief forces destroyed, its naval superiority long since surrendered, Tervel moved. The question of whether this assault was triggered by the formal treaty with Leo or by Arab foraging parties that had strayed across the boundary into Bulgarian territory. An explanation offered by the Syriac Chronicle of 846 as an alternative to the treaty interpretation remains genuinely disputed between the source traditions and is unlikely to be resolved without additional evidence. What is not disputed in any source tradition is the result. Theophanes records that Bulgarian forces killed 22,000 Arabs in the engagement. Sigebert of Gembloux, a Western chronicler writing entirely independently of the Byzantine tradition and for a different audience, records 30,000. The variance between these figures reflects the normal range of medieval casualty reporting, where different sources using different methodologies produce somewhat different numbers for the same events. The agreement between an Eastern Orthodox Byzantine chronicle and an independent Western Lombard chronicle on the approximate scale of the disaster is harder to dismiss. Arab accounts and Byzantine chronicles both record that Maslama's engineers, in the aftermath of the Bulgarian assault, began constructing additional defensive works around the Arab encampment. Lines facing not Constantinople, but the Bulgarian cavalry to the west. The geometry of the siege had completely inverted. The man who had arrived in August of 717 to build siege lines around the world's greatest city was now building defenses for his own camp, facing threats from two directions simultaneously, with no relief coming and no prospect of breakthrough. Later Western historians, the Bulgarian nationalist historical tradition prominent among them, gave Tervel the title Savior of Europe, which no contemporary source used, and which represents a retrospective judgment made centuries after the fact. Whether the title is earned depends on how seriously one takes the counterfactual about what an Arab breakthrough at Constantinople in 718 would have meant for the subsequent history of Europe. What the documents support, stripped of the later rhetorical framing, is this. Tervel's cavalry killed 22,000 or more of Maslama's soldiers at the moment when Maslama's position was already untenable. And after that engagement, Caliph Umar II sent the order to withdraw. The expedition was finished. On the 15th of August, 718, exactly 1 year after the siege had begun, the remnants of Maslama's army broke camp and departed from the fields outside Constantinople's walls. The departure was orderly. This was still a professional army under command, however diminished. And Theophanes records that Byzantine forces did not attempt to pursue or harass the retreating land force as it withdrew through Asia Minor. The decision to allow the retreat to proceed without interference reflected either the exhaustion of defenders who had spent 13 months behind walls, a prudent assessment of Arab tactical discipline even in retreat, or a strategic judgment that a broken army successfully leaving the field was a better outcome than a cornered army with nowhere to go and nothing to lose. Theophanes notes, with the significance that Byzantine chroniclers routinely assign to such coincidences, that August 15th coincided with the feast of the Dormition of the Theotokos, the Assumption of the Virgin Mary, one of the most important feasts in the Byzantine liturgical calendar. The siege had begun on August 15th, 717. It ended on August 15th, 718. The Byzantines did not record this symmetry as coincidence. They attributed their survival not to Leo's deceptions at Amorium, not to the wind shift on September 3rd, not to the Coptic defectors in spring, not to Tervel's cavalry, though they recorded all of these things in detail. but to the direct intercession of the Theotokos, whose feast day had framed both the opening and the closing of the most dangerous 13 months in Constantinople's long history of surviving things that should have destroyed it. This theological interpretation tells us something important about how Byzantine civilization processed its own survival, not as a demonstration of strategic brilliance or tactical innovation, but as evidence of divine care for the city and its people. The Arab land forces marched home. The fleet's return journey was something different entirely. As the Arab armada entered the Sea of Marmara and began its navigation toward the Aegean and the return voyage to Syria, it encountered a convergence of natural catastrophes that Theophanes records in terms that later readers consistently interpreted as providential punishment. A severe late summer storm struck the fleet as it was navigating the difficult waters between the Marmara and the Aegean. Separately, and this is documented not only in the Byzantine chronicles, but in the independent geological and historical record of volcanic activity in the Aegean. The volcano of Thera, the island now known as Santorini, erupted during this same period. Theophanes records that volcanic ash rained down on the retreating ships, superheated incendiary material settling on sails and rigging and setting them ablaze in a manner that sailors could not easily distinguish from a deliberate attack by a supernatural force. Byzantine naval patrols, operating in waters they controlled entirely, hunted whatever stragglers survived the combination of storm and volcanic ash and burning rigging. Theophanes claims that of the original 1,800 ships that had set out for Constantinople with the greatest expedition the medieval world had assembled, 5 survived the return journey to reach Syria. 5 ships from 1,800. Arab sources, acknowledging the catastrophe without providing an independently usable death toll, claim that 150,000 Muslims perished across the entire duration of the campaign. The Byzantinist John Haldon describes this figure as certainly inflated, but nevertheless indicative of the enormity of the disaster in medieval eyes. A careful formulation that neither accepts the number as literally accurate nor dismisses the underlying reality of catastrophic loss that the number represents in its exaggeration. 5 ships from 1,800. Whether Theophanes' claim is literally accurate, or whether it represents the same kind of rhetorical rounding toward totality that produced the 150,000 figure on the Arab side, both source traditions agree on the essential fact. What left Syria in 717 did not come back in any meaningful sense. The expedition that Caliph Suleiman had launched with prophetic certainty about his destiny returned as ash. The Arab force that besieged Constantinople was composed primarily of the Ahl al-Sham, the quote 7 the veteran Syrian and Jaziran soldiers who were, as multiple historical assessments consistently agree, the foundational pillar of Umayyad military and political power. These were not ordinary soldiers assembled for a single campaign and easily replaced by the next recruitment cycle. They were the military aristocracy of the Caliphate, men whose collective tactical experience represented decades of continuous frontier warfare on multiple fronts simultaneously, whose institutional knowledge of Arab military practice had been built through campaigns stretching from the Atlantic coast of Iberia to the mountain passes of the Hindu Kush. Their tactical sophistication, their unit cohesion, their experience of operating together in the complex combined arms operations that characterized Umayyad military campaigns at their most effective. None of this could be quickly replaced, because none of it could be quickly created. You can forge swords and breed horses in a year. You cannot rebuild in a year what 20 years of continuous combat experience produces in a military formation. The historian Bernard Lewis observed, in his analysis of the Umayyad Caliphate's trajectory after 718, that the financial strain of equipping, maintaining, and subsequently losing such a colossal expedition, aggravated the fiscal oppression within the caliphate in ways that contributed directly and materially to the internal dissent that would ultimately destroy it. The logistical infrastructure alone, the years of stockpiled provisions, the fleet of 1,800 ships, the 12,000-man supply train with its 6,000 camels and 6,000 donkeys, the siege engines, the weapons, the specialized naval equipment, had required years to assemble, and nearly none of it returned. The financial hemorrhage from the expedition's total loss was not a temporary setback that could be absorbed and recovered from in a few years of normal taxation. It was a structural blow to the caliphate's fiscal capacity at the same moment that the political legitimacy sustaining the taxation structure was being called into question from multiple directions simultaneously. The strategic consequence was, in one clear sense, simple and permanent. The explicit goal of conquering Constantinople was abandoned by the Arab caliphates following this defeat and never seriously renewed. Regular raiding of Byzantine Anatolia resumed from 720 or 721 onward and would continue for generations, inflicting significant economic damage and occasional military humiliation on Byzantine forces in Asia Minor. But these were raids, punishing, strategically significant, economically damaging raids, not existential expeditionary campaigns aimed at eliminating the Byzantine state. Wikipedia's synthesis of the Arab-Byzantine Wars states the strategic transformation clearly. Quote, _9, __. The Byzantine Arab frontier stabilized along the Taurus Mountains, where it would remain, contested and violent and economically costly to both sides, but not fundamentally altered in strategic character. Until the Seljuk Turks arrived in the 11th century with a different military system, different strategic objectives, and the capacity to exploit Byzantine vulnerabilities that the Umayyad system had never been able to crack. The Umayyad state did not survive to the end of the 7th century of its existence. The factors producing its collapse in 750 were multiple and mutually reinforcing. Fiscal distress created by the costs of overextended empire, provincial resentment from non-Arab Muslims who had converted to Islam but were still taxed as non-believers, religious controversy about the legitimacy of Umayyad rule, the organizational genius and ideological coherence of the Abbasid opposition movement. Historians debate with appropriate caution how directly the defeat at Constantinople contributed to the conditions of 750. And intellectual honesty requires acknowledging that the causal chain runs through 32 years of complex, multivariable political history that cannot be reduced to the aftermath of a single campaign. What can be said with confidence is that the Hashemite Abbasid revolution was fueled by precisely the types of internal dissent: fiscal grievance, provincial alienation, military failure, loss of the dynasty's aura of divinely favored invincibility, that failed imperial expeditions of this scale reliably accelerate. The Abbasid dynasty that replaced the Umayyads relocated the caliphate's capital from Damascus to Baghdad, reorienting the empire's strategic center of gravity away from the Mediterranean world. And as medievalists.net observes, never again substantially challenged Byzantine maritime power. The empire that had sent 1,800 ships to Constantinople sent none to its successor. Leo III saved the Byzantine Empire from the greatest external threat it had faced in its 3-century existence. He then spent the next 12 years methodically dismantling the spiritual and ecclesiastical foundations of the civilization he had just saved, triggering a century of internal conflict that would cost the empire far more in cultural, political, and diplomatic terms than any battle it fought in that period against external enemies. The theological reasoning driving Leo's Iconoclast program is documented across multiple sources and is coherent in its own terms, which makes it worth examining carefully rather than dismissing as religious irrationality. Leo had grown up in the eastern Syrian borderlands, where the boundaries between Byzantine Christianity and the Islamic world were not sharp lines on a map, but lived daily realities, where the two religions competed for adherence, where theological arguments crossed cultural lines, where the Islamic prohibition on religious imagery was not an abstract doctrine, but a visible, present feature of the religious landscape Leo had inhabited since childhood. The strict Islamic anarchism, the complete prohibition on depicting God, prophets, or holy figures in art, had begun suggesting to some Eastern Byzantine Christians that the Muslims might be right about this particular question, and that the proliferation of sacred images in Byzantine churches represented a form of idolatry that God was actively punishing by allowing Islamic expansion. When Leo survived an assault by the world's most powerful military force, a force explicitly framing its campaign as a divinely mandated holy war, the theological conclusion he drew was not simply that Byzantine arms had triumphed through good preparation and tactical intelligence. It was that God had specifically validated the Iconoclast position by granting an impossible victory to an emperor who was already moving against images. Beginning in 726, Leo began systematically removing icons from churches across the empire, starting with the most prominent, including the famous golden image of Christ that had adorned the chalky gate of the imperial palace. In 730, he issued a formal imperial decree ordering the destruction of all religious images and relics throughout Byzantine territory. The first major institutional casualty of the decree was Patriarch Germanus I, the same man who had placed the crown on Leo's head in the Hagia Sophia on the 25th of March, 717, who had made Leo emperor in the most formal sense that Byzantine ceremony could accomplish, and who had publicly and explicitly opposed the Iconoclast decree on theological grounds. Leo dismissed him. A compliant iconoclast was installed in his place. The message was unambiguous. Theological agreement with imperial policy was now a precondition for holding the empire's highest ecclesiastical office. The reaction across the empire was immediate, deep, and geographically revealing in what it disclosed about Byzantine religious sociology. In the eastern provinces, the borderlands where Leo's theological sensibility had formed, where the Islamic alternative was a daily presence, and where the arguments against image veneration had been developing among local clergy for years before Leo gave them imperial force, iconoclasm found substantial support. Among Greek-speaking Byzantines, particularly in the urban heartland of the Aegean world, the islands, and the Italian territories, the destruction of icons venerated for generations produced outrage that moved quickly and predictably toward active resistance. A revolt in Greece in 727, driven primarily by religious opposition to the decree, required a Byzantine naval force to suppress, and the fleet subsequently dispatched to Italy to enforce the policy in the Western territories was largely destroyed by a storm, which iconophile contemporaries interpreted with completely unsurprising consistency as divine commentary on Leo's program. The conflict with Rome deepened across Leo's reign into something approaching permanent institutional rupture. Pope Gregory II and Pope Gregory III both condemned iconoclasm publicly and explicitly in language that left no ambiguity about Rome's position. Gregory III convened a Roman synod in 731 that formally condemned Leo's policy in the strongest terms available to it. Leo retaliated by confiscating papal estates in southern Italy and transferring ecclesiastical jurisdiction over Sicily, Calabria, and Illyricum from Roman to Constantinopolitan authority. A significant territorial and financial blow to papal power that also signaled Leo's willingness to use imperial authority against the institutional church when it resisted his theological program. This accumulating friction between the emperor who had defended Eastern Christianity against the greatest external threat it had faced, and the papacy that regarded itself as the church's ultimate authority on earth, pushed Rome toward the Carolingian Franks, the military power in Western Europe that the papacy increasingly needed as its secular protector. This alignment eventually produced Charlemagne's coronation as Emperor of the Romans on Christmas Day, 800, a claim that Constantinople never accepted and that formalized the fracture between Eastern and Western Christianity into something close to permanent institutional separation. Iconoclasm convulsed the Byzantine Empire for over a century. Through its first partial resolution at the Second Council of Nicaea in 787, and its second eruption and final defeat in 843. The art destroyed across those decades, mosaics, icons, and devotional objects accumulated through 3 centuries of Byzantine civilization, cannot be recovered. Leo had defeated the army that came to destroy Constantinople. He then launched a slower and ultimately more successful campaign against the culture the walls had been protecting. The Battle of Tours, sometimes called the Battle of Poitiers, took place in 732, 14 years after the Arab siege of Constantinople ended. It is the engagement that Western European historiography most consistently and prominently identifies as the decisive moment that stopped Islamic expansion into Europe. Charles Martel, who commanded the Frankish forces and defeated the Arab raiding force commanded by Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi, became one of the foundational figures of the Carolingian mythology that shaped medieval Western European historical self-understanding. It appears in the standard history curricula of Western European countries, in popular historical writing about decisive moments in Western history, and in the cultural memory of medieval Christendom in a way that the Second Arab Siege of Constantinople, 717 to 718, simply does not. Historians who have examined both engagements with systematic attention to the actual military and strategic circumstances of each have been consistent in their comparative assessment. The Arab force defeated at Tours was a raiding party, a large and well-organized raiding party capable of inflicting significant damage and operating deep into Frankish territory, but not an existential expeditionary campaign equipped with the logistical infrastructure, the siege capability, the naval component, and the explicit strategic objective of conquering and holding Western European territory. Tours was a battle that stopped a raid. The Second Arab Siege of Constantinople was something categorically, fundamentally different. A planned, multi-year, fully resourced, strategically sophisticated campaign to eliminate the Byzantine state entirely, backed by the total mobilization capacity of the most powerful empire on earth at that historical moment. Warren Treadgold has calculated that the Arab host assembled for the Constantinople campaign may have outnumbered the entire Byzantine army. Not just the garrison of the city, but the total military force the empire possessed. John Halden has characterized the siege as representing a credible threat to extinguish the empire entirely. The difference in scale, ambition, and potential consequence between the two engagements is not a matter of scholarly opinion. It is a structural fact of the military history. The geographic and strategic logic of what would have followed a Byzantine collapse in 718 is worth tracing carefully, while being clear that it represents historians' informed argument rather than established historical fact. Since counterfactuals are, by definition, not directly verifiable. Constantinople controlled the Bosphorus, the strategic crossing between Asia Minor and Europe. the geographic choke point through which any sustained military advance from the Near East into the Balkans and beyond would necessarily pass. A Umayyad force that captured Constantinople and established secure control of both shores of the Bosphorus would control this gateway. The maritime routes of the Eastern Mediterranean and the most direct lines of advance into southeastern Europe. Bulgaria, surrounded on three sides by the power that had just eliminated Byzantine civilization, would face Islamic expansion without any Christian power behind it to provide strategic depth or military support. The kingdoms of Western Europe in 718 were fragmented along territorial, tribal, and dynastic lines, militarily reliant on localized feudal levies with minimal strategic coordination, and entirely without the professional institutional capacity, the trained standing armies, the logistical expertise, the administrative sophistication that the Byzantine state had maintained in continuous institutional descent from the Roman Empire. Historians, including Warren Treadgold and John Holden, argue, with serious scholarly reasoning behind the argument, that there would have been no organized resistance capable of stopping a sustained advance into the Balkans and Central Europe following a Byzantine collapse. This is their argument, presented as such. But it is the argument of serious specialists in the relevant military and political history, and it deserves to be taken seriously rather than dismissed. What is not argument but documented historical arithmetic is the simple fact of survival. The Theodosian walls that Maslama could not breach in 717 and 718 stood for 735 more years after the siege ended. They fell to the artillery of Mehmet II on the 29th of May, 1453. After 53 days of sustained bombardment with cannon technology that did not exist in the 8th century and would not exist for another 7 centuries. The weapon that eventually ended Byzantine civilization was not Arab cavalry, not naval supremacy, not the combined arms expeditionary capacity of the Umayyad Caliphate at its peak. It was gunpowder, and it required 7 more centuries to arrive. Everything that happened in Constantinople and in Byzantium and in the Eastern Mediterranean world and in the Balkans between 718 and 1453. Every one of those 735 years of Roman institutional survival, of the preservation and transmission of classical learning, of Orthodox Christianity's development as a civilizational tradition, of Byzantine influence on the emerging cultures of Eastern Europe, all of it traces back, in some meaningful and not trivially dismissible sense, to the chain Leo raised in the dark on the night of September the 3rd, 717. Theophanes the Confessor records what the Coptic Christian sailors did in the spring of 718. He records that they rode to the Byzantine lines under cover of darkness. He records that they provided Leo with exact intelligence on the disposition, strength, and precise anchoring positions of the Arab reinforcement fleets. He records that their defection crippled both fleets before the Greek fire-equipped dromons completed the destruction. The information they carried was arguably the single most operationally decisive intelligence contribution of the entire 13-month siege. Without exact knowledge of where the Arab fleets had anchored, Leo's preemptive strike could not have been as precise, as comprehensive, or as complete. The defectors made the spring 718 counteroffensive possible in the form it took. No source records a single name. No source records what happened to any of them after the defection. Whether they were given land grants, monetary rewards, military commissions, or simply absorbed into the enormous and diverse population of a city they had helped save. The chronicles that preserved their decisive action did not consider their subsequent lives worth a sentence. History does this with regularity. It preserves what was done at the moment of maximum consequence, and forgets the people who did it, particularly when those people were conscripts rather than commanders, subjects rather than sovereigns, nameless participants in events that history chose to attribute to the leaders who directed them. Leo III reigned until the 18th of June, 741, 24 years after his coronation in crisis. 23 years after the siege that defined his historical legacy ended. His later reign was not without genuine achievement beyond the siege's survival. He won the major victory at Akroinon in 740 that drove Arab forces out of Asia Minor and demonstrated that the Byzantine military, reorganized and commanded effectively, could defeat Umayyad forces in open field battle. He reformed the Byzantine legal code with the Ecloga in 726, a significant legal achievement that updated and simplified imperial law in ways that persisted through subsequent Byzantine legal development. He subdivided the great thematic armies, the same institutional structure he had used to build his own path to the throne, specifically to prevent future ambitious generals from using them as platforms for throne seizure in the way he had. He died in his bed as emperor, as the founder of the Isaurian dynasty that would rule until 802, having provided the empire with the political stability it had been unable to sustain for 22 years before him. He was never forgiven by Rome for iconoclasm. He was never forgiven by large portions of the Byzantine Greek population for destroying icons venerated for generations. He died having saved the empire and having fractured the church that the empire contained. The full contradiction of his legacy was complete before he was buried. Maslama ibn Abd al-Malik continued serving the Umayyad Caliphate after Constantinople with the resilience of a professional soldier, whose identity was not contingent on any single campaign's outcome. Dispatched to suppress the Kharijite religious faction in Iraq, later appointed governor of Iraq, a major provincial command whose authority extended over the eastern half of the Caliphate. Later deployed to the Caucasus for campaigns against the Khazar Khaganate in 727 and 728 that proved difficult, bloody, and largely indecisive. He retired eventually to his extensive agricultural estates in northern Syria. He died on the 24th of December, 738, exactly 20 years and 4 months after the Arab fleet abandoned the waters of Constantinople, when the Abbasid dynasty overthrew the Umayyads in 750 and conducted the systematic persecution of the Umayyad family that typically followed such revolutionary transfers of power. Maslama's descendants were, as Wikipedia records drawing on Arab sources, largely spared out of respect for his battlefield reputation. He had lost the most famous campaign of his career. His enemy's successors protected his family in acknowledgement of the professional standard he had maintained throughout that career. The man who outdeceived him left him that, at least. Khan Tervel's later life presents genuine historiographic difficulties that honesty requires acknowledging. Wikipedia notes with appropriate scholarly caution that Theophanes the Confessor may have confused Tervel with his successor Cormasios in recording the Treaty of 716, which introduces real uncertainty about whether the man personally commanding the Bulgarian forces in 718 was Tervel himself or a successor acting on his treaty's terms. This uncertainty does not alter the fundamental military reality of what the Bulgarian intervention accomplished or its significance for the siege's outcome. Tervel, or the ruler acting in his institutional legacy, is venerated as a saint in the Bulgarian Orthodox Church with a feast day on October the 2nd. Later historians, the Bulgarian nationalist historical tradition prominent among them, though the title has been adopted more broadly, gave him the retrospective designation Savior of Europe, which no contemporary source used which represents a judgment formed centuries after the fact, rather than a contemporary recognition of what had been accomplished. Whether the title is deserved depends on how seriously one takes the counterfactual about what would have happened to Europe if the Arab expedition of 717 had succeeded. The 22,000 Arabs that Theophanes records being killed by Tervel's forces cannot be retroactively thanked for what they prevented. History preserved what was done. It forgot who did it. Every military advantage Maslama brought to Constantinople was real and genuinely formidable. The numerical superiority, 80,000 to 120,000 against perhaps 15,000, was real. The professional quality and collective experience of the Ahl al-Sham was real. The decade of systematic preparation and resource accumulation was real. The strategic logic of a combined land and sea blockade against a city that could only be taken by starvation, given the impenetrability of the Theodosian walls to any technology available in 717, was sound. What failed at Constantinople was not an incompetent plan encountering random misfortune. It was a professionally designed plan encountering a specific set of conditions that it had not fully accounted for, each of which in isolation would have been manageable, but which in combination became a cascade of failures from which no recovery was possible. The first and most fundamental lesson the siege demonstrates is the decisive importance of interior supply lines in a strategic blockade. Maslama's entire strategic premise, the logic on which the entire expedition was built, rested on the naval blockade, severing Constantinople's maritime supply routes and making the starvation strategy feasible. The blockade failed on its third day of operation, before the winter that destroyed the Arab army's provisions had even begun, before the Coptic defectors had provided the intelligence that destroyed the reinforcement fleets, before Tervel's cavalry had struck the siege lines from the rear. The city was resupplied from the Black Sea throughout every month of the 13-month siege. This is not primarily a lesson about Greek fire, though Greek fire was the instrument. It is not primarily a lesson about wind direction, though the September 3rd wind shift was the precipitating event. It is a structural lesson about the relationship between a defender's geography and a blockade's viability. A city that retains access to even one secure resupply route can survive indefinitely against a blockade of theoretically overwhelming force. And Constantinople's triangular peninsula provided exactly that access to the Black Sea approaches in the north. Leo's 3-year provisions mandate was the redundant guarantee of survival in case that access was interrupted. The naval failure meant the redundancy was never tested. The second lesson involves what military analysts in later centuries would call the management of enemy disaffection. The Coptic Christian conscripts who crewed the Arab reinforcement fleets were subjects of a conquered population performing military service they had not chosen, in support of a religious war whose purpose was the defeat of the world's largest Christian city. Their primary loyalties, religious, cultural, familial, ran directly contrary to the expedition's stated objectives. An army that depends on conscripted manpower from populations whose fundamental loyalties oppose the campaign's purpose carries a structural vulnerability that no numerical advantage can compensate for. When the Coptic sailors found a viable alternative to serving on those ships, when they saw the Byzantine walls across the water and understood that rowing toward them was a genuine option, the fleet's operational capacity collapsed within hours. The lesson was available to any commander who paid attention to the composition of his forces. The consequences of ignoring it were decisive. The third lesson is the most personal and, in some ways, the most difficult to systematize, because it concerns a capability that cannot be manufactured on demand or transferred through training programs. Leo's ability to negotiate with Maslama in Arabic not merely linguistically, but in the full cultural and diplomatic register that Arabic negotiations with Umayyad commanders required, gave him 4.5 months of preparation time. 4.5 months during which the Arab army that should have been devastating Byzantine territory was instead standing down in expectation of a compliant new emperor. 4.5 months during which Leo stockpiled 3 years of provisions, positioned his fleet, secured the Bulgarian alliance, and repaired the city's fortifications. All of it, every subsequent Byzantine advantage in the siege, was purchased with a deception made possible by a childhood on the Syrian borderlands, where Arabic was as natural as Greek. Knowing your enemy's language and culture is not a diplomatic courtesy. At Constantinople in 716 and 17, it was the margin between survival and extinction. The fourth lesson addresses what might be called the numerical fallacy, the assumption that sufficiently large numerical superiority automatically produces victory regardless of terrain, logistics, and operational conditions. Maslama arrived with forces the sources consistently place between 5-1 and 8-1 against the defenders. He never brought that army to bear on the problem he was actually trying to solve. The Theodosian walls presented 5.5 kilometers of defensible front. The peninsula's geography channeled any land assault into a narrow approach that prevented mass concentration regardless of how many men waited behind the front of the assault. The failed naval blockade meant there was no second axis of approach from the water to compensate for the land assault's geometric limitations. Maslama had assembled the right army for a different problem, an army capable of overwhelming opposition in the open field. In the kind of mobile operational warfare the Ahl al-Sham had perfected across decades of frontier campaigning, Constantinople was not that problem. It was a geometric problem, and Maslama's numbers were irrelevant to its solution. Ask 100 educated people to name the battle that stopped Islamic expansion into Europe in the early medieval period. Most will say Tours. A significant minority will express uncertainty. Almost none will name Constantinople, 717 to 718. The obscurity of an event that historians consistently characterize as one of the most consequential defensive engagements in medieval history is not an accident of cultural memory or a simple failure of popular education. It has structural causes that are worth understanding, because they reveal something important about how military history gets preserved, transmitted, and eventually celebrated versus how it gets made. The siege's historical record rests on a single primary source tradition in a way that more famous medieval engagements do not. Theophanes the Confessor, writing approximately 90 years after the events he describes, provides the main Byzantine account, drawing from a now lost primary source composed during Leo III's own reign, meaning the earliest surviving detailed narrative of the siege was written by people whose institutional positions, careers, and physical safety depended on depicting Leo favorably. Patriarch Nikephoros I provides a secondary Byzantine account with minor chronological differences from Theophanes' version, primarily a dispute about whether the siege began on July 15th or August 15th. But both Theophanes and Nikephoros appear to have used the same underlying pro-Leo primary source, which means the two accounts are not truly independent of each other in the way that would give historians confidence in the details they agree on. The Arab sources, as Wikipedia's scholarly synthesis explicitly notes, __quote _13 ___ that reflect the distance of those sources from the events and the Arab tradition's discomfort with the magnitude of the defeat. A military engagement whose historical record consists of one biased Byzantine tradition and several confused Arab traditions, with no truly independent, contemporaneous, neutral account, is structurally vulnerable to historiographic neglect in ways that more richly documented events are not. What the Arab sources produced in place of a reliable historical counter-narrative was something more culturally durable and more psychologically satisfying than accurate history. A legend of symbolic victory. In Arab literary and historical tradition, the siege of Constantinople was transformed into a story in which Maslama had, in the end, achieved a kind of ceremonial triumph, entering the city on horseback, receiving Leo's formal submission and promises of tribute, departing with honor after establishing the symbolic precedence of Islamic power over Byzantine Christianity. Wikipedia documents that this legend was culturally productive enough to influence Arabic epic literature, including narrative cycles embedded in the 1001 Nights, one of the most widely read, translated, and culturally influential literary collections in human history. The army that suffered one of the most catastrophic military defeats of the medieval period wrote a story in which it had won, and that story circulated for centuries in one of the world's most beloved literary traditions, while the accurate account of what actually happened gathered dust in Byzantine monasteries read only by specialists. The Battle of Tours achieved its prominence in Western European historical memory, partly through factors that had nothing to do with its actual military or strategic significance, and everything to do with the institutional interests of the people who wrote Western European history. Western European medieval scholarship was conducted primarily by Catholic clerics working within institutions that had direct connections, ecclesiastical, political, financial, to the Carolingian dynasty that Charles Martel founded and that Charlemagne brought to its apex. Tours was the Carolingian dynasty's foundational military achievement, the moment their patron's grandfather proved his family's fitness to lead Christendom. Constantinople was an Eastern Orthodox empire's victory, geographically distant from the centers of Western European scholarship, doctrinally foreign in ways that widened over the following centuries as the Eastern and Western churches diverged. And in the centuries following the formal schism of 1054, actively treated as something outside the mainstream Christian story that Western European historians were primarily interested in preserving and celebrating. The siege simply had no institutional constituency to champion its significance in the cultural spaces where historical memory was manufactured. The siege also produced no clean narrative ending of the kind that historical memory requires for easy transmission. It did not result in a peace treaty that formally ended a war. It did not produce a territorial change that could be pointed to on a map. It did not generate a political transformation that visibly altered the structure of either empire. It resulted in continued survival, the absence of defeat, the continuation of an existence that had briefly seemed threatened. Absence is harder to dramatize than triumph. Arab raids resumed from 720 onward, and the Byzantine-Arab struggle continued for generations with all its usual mixture of Byzantine tactical victories and strategic stalemates. No moment afterward announced itself as the legacy of what had happened in 717 and 718. The walls were still standing. The city was still there. The greatest defensive victory in Byzantine history was, in narrative terms, the story of something that did not happen, and not happenings resist commemoration. The rediscovery of the siege's significance has been slow, primarily academic, and still largely confined to specialists in Byzantine history and medieval military history. Historians including John Haldon, Warren Treadgold, and the scholars building on Rodolphe Guillon's 1955 foundational study of the expedition have consistently characterized the siege as among the most consequential defensive engagements in medieval history. Military institutions study it because the principles it demonstrates, the decisive importance of interior supply lines, the multiplier effect of enemy disaffection as intelligence, the limits of numerical superiority against prepared geographic advantages, do not become obsolete when the tactical context that produced them changes. You cannot replicate the Theodosian walls or the Great Chain or Greek fire in a modern military context. You can replicate the logic of their use, and that logic remains relevant. The Theodosian walls still stand in Istanbul, or the ruins of them still stand along the western edge of the old city, where Maslama's army built its circumvallation lines in 717. Tourists walk past them on their way to the Hagia Sophia, past the stone and brick and mortar that Byzantine engineers built in 413, and that held against 20 major medieval sieges before finally yielding to Ottoman cannon in 1453. Few people stop at the walls now. There are no monuments to September the 3rd, 717, at the place where the chain was raised and the first Arab ships burned. No plaques mark the harbors where Coptic Christian conscripts rowed toward an enemy shore in the dark. No markers identify the ground where Tervel's cavalry destroyed 22,000 Arab soldiers in the engagement that broke Maslama's position permanently. History did not build monuments to this victory. It simply, quietly, allowed the consequences of that victory to accumulate across 735 years of continued Byzantine civilization. You cannot commemorate a city that did not fall. You can only notice, years later, that it was still standing when everything else had been tried. The army that came to Constantinople in the summer of 717 had food for years. They had brought wheat to plant and harvest. They had brought seeds, farming implements, 1,800 ships, and everything the medieval world could assemble against a single city. Arab sources claim 150,000 Muslims perished across the campaign, a figure the Byzantinist John Halden describes as __, quote _14__. Even at a fraction of that total, even at the most conservative modern estimates, the losses were catastrophic. Men of the Ahl al-Sham, the military aristocracy of the most powerful empire on earth, veterans of campaigns that had stretched from the Atlantic coast of Iberia to the passes of the Hindu Kush, dying in a frozen Thracian field outside a wall they never touched. The city fed itself from the Black Sea and watched them starve. What Leo achieved appears, in retrospect, almost impossible to account for with the evidence available. And the sources are careful enough, drawn from enough independent traditions that disagree on details while agreeing on the essential sequence, that dismissing the account as Byzantine self-congratulation without historical foundation cannot be sustained. A force that the sources consistently place at somewhere between 5-1 and 8-1 against the defenders was neutralized systematically over 13 months. Its naval arm destroyed within 72 hours of the fleet's arrival in the Bosphorus. Its winter endurance broken by a logistical failure from which there was no recovery. Its reinforcement fleets eliminated by intelligence that its own conscripted sailors provided. Its remaining land forces broken by a cavalry charge from a direction it had never adequately prepared to defend against. None of this was luck, though the wind on September the 3rd came close to it. The 3 years of provisions were a decision made in the first days of a new reign. The fleet hidden in the Golden Horn was a decision made by a man who had spent 4.5 months ensuring that the city's most powerful weapon was positioned where it could be used at the first moment of opportunity. The Bulgarian alliance was a decision made by a man who understood that the empire's survival might depend on the self-interested calculations of a ruler who had recently been its enemy. The Arabic language deception at Amorium that bought the time to make all of those decisions was a decision made by a man for whom Arabic was not a foreign language carefully learned, but a mother tongue, a fact of childhood on the Syrian borderlands that became, in the crisis of 716 and 717, the margin between survival and extinction. The Theodosian walls that Maslama could not breach still stand in Istanbul. The formula for Greek fire was never written down, was maintained as a state secret for 4 centuries, and has never been recovered. The names of the Egyptian Christians who rode to the Byzantine lines in the dark, whose action was arguably the most operationally decisive intelligence contribution of the entire siege, whose defection made the destruction of the reinforcement fleets possible in the comprehensive form it took, are not recorded in any source. History preserved what they did. It forgot who they were. This is what history does most of the time. To most of the people whose decisions and sacrifices produce the outcomes that history then attributes to the commanders who directed them. In 718, the walls held, and the army that couldn't breach them, the army that came with seeds to plant their own harvest, with prophetic certainty about caliphs bearing prophets' names, with 1,800 ships and the accumulated confidence of 80 years of nearly unbroken conquest, went home in a storm, past a volcano that was not yet finished with them, and did not come back. Sometimes preparation beats numbers. Sometimes geography beats armies. Sometimes the most decisive weapon in a 13-month siege is not Greek fire or cavalry or fortification engineering, but the fact that a man grew up speaking the enemy's language on a borderland where 2 civilizations overlapped and remembered everything he heard. Sometimes a chain raised in the dark, on the night of a reversed wind, is the hinge on which 735 years turn.